Oh, got this. I've so got this. This is genius. I don't know why I didn't think of this before. I'm so pleased with myself, it's ridiculous. Alright, here's the thing. I've been, for entertainment, watching YouTube videos, and something that comes up a lot. It was more a thing 4 months back, and more recently than that, a bit after that, was before and after the release of Ghostbusters. And the back and forth discussion, the reason there was a discussion at all about this, what turned out to be a stupid, mediocre summer film, but according to people who saw it, and I did a video where I'm like, I refuse to see this movie, and here's why. I'll probably link to that video in the description. That's fine. But I had problems with both sides, obviously, because the discussion from the one side was people were saying bad things about the trailer because they're misogynists. You've heard this a million times already. I'm not going to go over that too much. But the other side to it, you had people, I forget his name. One person was saying, well, women just aren't funny. And I'm like, well, that's not right either. And, you know, what I'm saying is I didn't agree with either side of the argument I was seeing, or the extremes of them. And I'm like, I need a cogent paradigm, a movie that exemplifies my point of view. This is what I think. Here you go. Not just me explaining it, but here's a movie that explains it for me. Like, I think these things about women in comedy, women in movies, this particular movie, people's reactions to it, here's a movie that just, this is what I think. And there you go. Look at that movie and just tell me I'm wrong. And I couldn't think of one. People used it as an example of, well, what do you mean people hate movies just because women star in them? That's stupid. There's the Alien franchise, Kill Bill, Thelma and Louise. I mean, you could just go on and on. Ultraviolet, Aeon Flux, both the cartoon and the the live-action movie based on. You could just go on and on. Carrie, I'd argue Mary Poppins is actually a surprisingly good example of reviewing that. I said something about it like, oh, Mary Poppins is a good example. Looking into it a little more closely, Mary Poppins is a surprisingly good example. Mary Poppins herself is the only, and the children perhaps, are only really together competent characters. All the powerful male figures in that, with the possible exception of Dick Van Dyke's character, who's a goddamn chimney sweep, all of them are seen as, men in particular, are seen as kind of incompetent, stuffy, stupid, blah, blah, blah. Even the suffragists we see are more competent than any man in the film. Forward thinking for a film that far back. But I couldn't, but none of that's quite right. None of it's quite right. Because we're comparing horror movies and action movies and sci-fi and all this jazz to a comedy. I've mentioned before, I don't think the original Ghostbusters is a pure comedy. Look at my video regarding that. But this Ghostbusters, the 2016 Ghostbusters, is a comedy starring with a women protagonist. That's where we have to start, and that's what we have to compare it to. And the genius thing, I'm calling myself a genius, the genius thing I came up with not even an hour ago. I was watching, I think, Chris Reagan's video on, at that point, it was like from 4 months ago, the movie hadn't even come out at that point. And there was already, people who don't like this movie are sexist. It was ridiculous. I was looking at his video, and then I had this sort of inspiration. A really good example of the perfect movie. Because, like I said, I'd also looked at videos where one guy was saying, like, women just aren't funny. And I'm like, that's not true. Like, a bunch of female leads would be hilarious, and they have been hilarious in other films. But I wanted a really good one, and I found one. I thought of one, and I just thought I was brilliant for thinking of this. I've been running around the house, like, explaining exactly what I've just gone over, and then going, Fucking 9 to 5. So, I'm going to review 9 to 5. Okay, here's the thing. The movie 9 to 5 is a comedy from 1980. I need to pull up some information on this. This is a movie from a while back. And I just had a thing up on it. It's a movie that was released in 9 to 5. American comedy written by Patricia Resnick. So it was written by a woman. And someone else. Regardless, it starred Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin, and Dolly Parton. And what was interesting about that is, while Lily Tomlin is a well-established comedian, I mean, once again, totally tells a lie to this stupid, women just aren't funny in movies. Shit, Lily Tomlin's hilarious. Around that era, late 70s, early 80s, you also had Carol Burnett. You still had very much the tail end of her career, but I believe she was still alive and doing a couple things here and there. You had Lucille Ball, other very talented comedians who just happened to be women. But you had Lily Tomlin, Jane Fonda, and the interesting thing was Dolly Parton, because I'm talking about a movie from 1980, which is, say, if you were born the year this movie came out, you're in your 30s. So if you're a 20-something, this is way out of your sphere. So let's go over it a little. Obviously, people know who Dolly Parton is now, but understand she had this, like any actress, singer, whatever, career goes up and down. At this point in her career, Dolly Parton was a country western singer. She kind of had become really popular for a little while, but then was kind of fading out of the public awareness. This film kind of reignited her as not just a performer, but also an actress. She actually does the theme song to this movie, the opening song 9 to 5, which is the titular song. And it's a good song. I just started downloading it, and I'm like listening to it, and I'm like, oh wow, yeah, that's really fucking catchy. This is a great song. And like the first few minutes of it, like I'm actually gonna just record this little bit here, watch the whole thing again, because I don't want to go off memory. I think the last time I've seen this movie from beginning to end, I was a teenager. Like we saw it on Cinemax or something, at some point, like forever ago. And this film frames it perfectly. It puts a lie to every single argument I disagree with on the Ghostbusters film. It's like, well, women need their movies too. Well, shit, they had their movies and still do. There are wonderful films with all-female casts or all-female protagonists. This movie is a weirdly good example of it. I've heard that some people are saying, like I said, I'm not going to see this Ghostbusters film. But I've heard people say that the Ghostbusters film is weirdly misandrist. Like, it just hates men. And I'm like, well, that's whatever. 9 to 5 is so great. Because it's, briefly, and I can't believe I'm about to say this, but alright, spoilers for a movie from freaking 1980. And I think that's kind of necessary because it is a film from 1980. It's not so much that, this just came out, you haven't had a chance to see it. I mean, this film, you've had 36 years to see it. But it's so far enough back in the past that maybe you haven't seen it. And I just checked. You can't. It doesn't seem to be a free Netflix film. It's probably on someone else. I'm rooting around trying to find someplace good to pick it up. So I've only streamed a few minutes of the opening of it. So we'll see how that goes. I do want to go into this, but let me be clear. From this point forward, it's going to be very spoiled. I was basically going to spoil the whole film because it's a great film. It needs to be discussed. It's a gem. It's a gem. Like I'd forgotten about it, and it's by itself, it's a gem. It's a great film that a lot of people haven't seen simply because they weren't alive to see it. Like it's far enough back, but not. It's not like Star Wars, which now that I think about it, came out around the same time. It's not like Star Wars or something where everyone's seen it simply because it's that huge of a movie. It wasn't that huge of a film, but a very good one, and like I said, kind of relevant to what we're talking about today. So that's what we're going to talk about it. Like I said, spoiler, spoiler, spoiler. Be aware. This is so perfect. This is such a perfect example. This is a goddamn amazing movie. So far, I'm watching little bits of it and stopping every so often, because that's how I watch movies nowadays, if I'm alone. That's why I have trouble watching movies when I'm all by myself. I tend to watch movies with other people because other people don't have the tolerance for my bullshit of stopping constantly and thinking about it or researching it or going off to make food or going for a walk or something. Honest to God, it takes me like the better part of a day to watch an hour and a half long movie. But this movie's great. This movie's really good. If you haven't seen 9 to 5, check this out. It's Lily Tomlin, Jane Fonda, and Dolly Parton. And getting into it a little bit, let's start at the beginning. The three of them are office workers. Jane Fonda's character is a brand new employee at this office. She's showing them, Lily Tomlin's character, I believe, is starting at the beginning. She's like, hey, welcome to the office. It's a shitty-ass place. These are the front lines. This place is crappy as hell. Essentially. She's like, basically going from department to department, explaining what things are, and we see that everything looks really dreary and awful. And the dreariness and awfulness of this office can be epitomized by a single character, and that is, what is his name? Mr. Hart. Let's go back to this. This is such a good movie. Mr. Hart is awful. He is a sexist, misogynist, racist, cruel. I mean, he's just an awful, awful boss. He's the boss played by Dabney Coleman. I forgot about that guy. He's an awesome actor, an awesome comedian, and the antagonist of this film. The premise is, he's just awful. He doesn't really, it's explained a bit at the beginning and then more and more as the film progresses, that he doesn't really do any work. He's just awful to his employees. He has other people do all the heavy lifting for his work. He has his secretarial pool, sign his papers for him and everything like that. So he does very little, and at the same time he starts rumors like he's had sex with Dolly Parton's character, a married woman. I mean, shit that would not fly today, one would hope. Even in 1980, it's like, this guy's awful, but we're just afraid for our jobs. He's an excellent antagonist. You hate him instantly, and you hate everything he does. And that's why it's so satisfying when the turnaround happens, when shit gets real in this movie. It feels great, and it happens early on. So just the whole film feels wonderful. You're just really enjoying this, and I mean, there's a line in the film that he's an autocratic, sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot. And this is what other people think of him. And he's just an awful boss. And that's kind of where the movie starts. I'm going to go through this, but all in all, this is not a complicated movie. The complexity of it is derived from the characters themselves, not from the overall structure. Let's get into that. That is worth a little bit of talking, of wording from me, my wording. God, I'm sitting here watching this movie. This was the best idea I've had in a long time. This movie's awesome. Okay, what was I talking about? The structure of this film. The premise of the film is very, very simple. It's basically, before I forget, let's go into the theme very briefly. The theme of this movie is vis-a-vis the 1980, like the very end of the 70s, 1980. Not the 1980s, 1980, 1980. Working women in the year 1980. Some of the problems they had, particularly with asshole bosses like this, who were awful and just made life a living hell for women trying to get by in 1980, is the theme. The premise of this film is, here's three women who work in this office. Oh, just a little bit about the actresses themselves. Lily Tomlin is a veteran comedian. She's awesome in this. She's believable, funny, great. Dolly Parton is not bad at all. She's very entertaining. So far, and I'm not that far into it yet. I'm getting by a little bit and then discussing it, things that occur to me at random. Jane Fonda's kind of the weak link. Her character isn't as easy to portray. She's very inexperienced, and Jane Fonda is not as good as an actress as the other two, but isn't bad. She isn't bad. She's good enough for this film, for that character, and she starts to pick up. In the beginning of this film, Jane Fonda's character, this is her first job. She's recently divorced, and in 1980 that was a huge deal. Where it was this, God, it's interesting the period it's in too, because we're past the point of a woman in the workplace, divorce, that's crazy. But at the same time, we're not into a period of later on in like the late 20th, early 21st century where it's like whatever, we all got problems. Where there's actually, she had this expectation of being a homemaker, and now she's forced to work, and she's trying to make a difficult transition when it's no longer this period where people are gonna like kind of help her along. It's like, look, lady, you want to play with the big boys, you got work to do, ma'am. And it's a very sympathetic character because she's very awkward socially. She feels like she's out of her depth. This is kind of she's an adult woman, and this is her first job ever, as opposed to the rest of them who've been worn down, just battle-hardened office workers. And she's kind of the foil for the other two characters. Like, yeah, life is shitty, and here's my take on it. Lily Tomlin's character is a widow with 4 kids. Dolly Parton's character is married and is very attractive and has a lecherous, evil boss. And it's like she doesn't want to lose her job, but this guy's gone way too far. Like, if I were in an office and anything like this happened, that man would be in jail. And not just for that. Like, there's the implication in this film that he's doing actual illegal stuff. And that's kind of the premise of this film. I'm jumping around a lot because I always do that. I'm sorry. Going on. I think I mentioned already, this is a great idea to review this film from 1980, because this is a really enjoyable film. Going through briefly. I say that constantly, I know. The word briefly. I need a t-shirt that says that. The premise is 3 office workers have to deal with Mr. Hart, who's an awful boss. His kind of, I guess she's an executive assistant, Roz, who's this really awful, nitpicky, anal retentive woman who just does Mr. Hart's will throughout the office. And it's a very large office. It's a very large office building in a large company. Early on in the film, we learned that the executive suite's on the 12th floor. Lily Tomlin's character, Violet, has never even met the chairman of the board. I mean, she's never even met the high-level guys. I mean, nowadays, it's interesting as a time capsule of office culture from 1980. Nowadays, I mean, I've done a lot of temp work in the past where I've worked in a lot of different offices, and invariably, it's the other way around. Like the executive, the high level executive, and particularly the people directly below them, where important decisions are made above them, but they really don't affect things directly below them as much, and particularly further down where the meat of the company is. They do a lot to kind of make themselves visible. Like, hey, I'm a guy who exists and has a high salary, so I'm really doing things. I definitely do exist. So they would be, constantly having meetings and all sorts of stuff going on, where they could introduce you to themselves and tell you about company culture and blah 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 blah. This is before that, and it's fascinating. Just that aspect of it is kind of cool as a neat depiction of what it's like to work in an office from 36 years ago. Jesus. It's cool. That part is cool. What else? The premise of this film. So the premise is the three of them kind of meet up, bond a bit. Jane Fonda's character, Judy, is she's like the rookie. They kind of help her out a bit. They bond. They have this evening where they smoke a lot of pot. Awesome scene. And they fantasize about how they would kill Mr. Hart because they fucking hate that asshole. And the scene where they're fantasizing about killing Mr. Hart's amazing. And ironic, because later on, a version of their fantasy sort of happens for each of them. Lily Tomlin's character, Violet, fantasizes about poisoning him, and she accidentally poisons his coffee at some point, for example. Over the course of they think they've nearly killed him, turns out they didn't, but he finds out that they think that they were trying to kill him. So he's like, well, I'll use that to my advantage, and I'm going to blackmail them. And they're really in a bind. Like, they're really scared. He's actually just fucking with them because he's an evil asshole. And thinks that it'll give him a huge advantage, and he'll like really have sex with Dolly Parton and what have you. But instead, the tables turn. And what they end up doing is having to kidnap him, basically, a full adult man, and kind of keep him hidden so that they can not go to jail. And they're just in a total panic. That's how it's played out. And the stress of that. So from that point forward, the thrust of this movie is, we have to find something illegal that Mr. Hart has done that we can pin on him as counter blackmail. Like, he won't drop any charges, we won't get him arrested. And that's where the tension of the film is, because while they're digging for dirt on Mr. Hart, they have him captured. And sooner or later, someone's going to notice he's gone. Now, to their advantage, like I said, Mr. Hart's an awful boss. He works through intermediaries so much that they just kind of pretend he's still in the office. Violet and Dolly Parton's character, they just do all his work for him, like they always do. And then, slowly but surely, they start going, well, Mr. Hart makes awful decisions. Let's make not awful decisions. And then that sort of happens. So basically the premise is, captured Mr. Hart, have to find a way to blackmail him so they can keep him from blackmailing them, and as quickly as possible, because sooner or later someone's going to notice that he's missing. So we have to, on top of digging for dirt, we have to delay anyone. Like, they do this thing where, like Roz, his executive assistant, is like starting to notice, like, she hasn't seen Mr. Hart in a while. And at one point they do a thing where it's like, oh, Mr. Hart? Why, he's right over there. I think he just passed by. And she like runs around a corner, and Violet's in front of the elevator, and Judy's actually in the elevator trying to get it to close as quickly as possible, and she's pretending to have a conversation with Mr. Hart, and it's like, oh, Roz, just as the doors had just closed. It's like, oh, you damn damn it, you just missed him. Stuff like that, where that's where the tension for most of the film comes from. Eventually, they find a way to get Roz out of the picture by having Mr. Hart send her to this academy where they learn foreign languages, or she learns French. And she's like, oh, this is... my boss is paying attention. The boss who I kind of idolize, which is creepy weird, has me being sent off to learn these special skills. How awesome is this? And she's going to learn to do that. The whole time they're... Meanwhile, while that's happening, the characters themselves are each flawed in some way. They lack self-esteem, or they're just kind of beaten down from experience, or they're struggling with this problem or that problem. And through the course of this movie, each of them has this sort of transformative arc where they, screw this, I'm going to become more assertive, I have to, I'm forced to by this this is standard transformative arc for a character. You could put the same theme in anything, Rassilus, Star Wars, you name it. It's basically I'm a flawed person for whatever reason. I perceive myself to be weak or lacking in some way, but incredible events force me to grow and change until I'm more whole and more capable than I was before, basically. Meanwhile, Mr. Hart is desperately trying to escape his prison, and the comic hilarity ensues all the way around. I guess in 1980, this would be considered kind of a dark comedy. Nowadays, it'd be like, no one would blink at this. But it's good. It's good. The datedness of it doesn't make it seem silly or goofy. It's just kind of, oh, that's the way things were. Like little details, like the guy making change. Like I had a... You kids today, you don't know. Like there's a guy where you'd hand him, on the street corners, where you'd hand him like $1 or something, and he had this little device on his belt that would give him 4 quarters, so he'd make change. At one point, that was a thing someone needed to do. Nowadays, it's like, well, a hot dog costs, what, $10? So here's my card. Here, swipe that. Doot, 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 done. And neat little things like that. Very nice touches. They have him. They find something. A little piece of something they can blackmail him with. It's not much, but it's something to go on, and he could see jail time for it, so they make an agreement with them. While they have him hog-tied and so on. As an aside, his wife is away on a vacation thing. It's not important. Convenience, da-da-da-da-da. They get the bit of evidence, but while they have that, and they're, like I said, they're making constant improvements to their office. Like, Mr. Hart makes awful decisions, so they're now able to make decisions for their office. Like real decisions. And slowly improving things while he's away, making real change. And no one ever sees Mr. Hart anyway, so fucking who's to know? So while they do that, Mr. Hart kind of... In the meantime, everyone thinks Mr. Hart's amazing now. Because it's like, oh wow, these new decisions you're making are awesome. They're improving productivity. Everything's great here. The environment is much better. People enjoy being here. Roz was sent away to do this thing where she's learning French. So it's like everyone's super happy at the office now that the boss and his administrative assistant are gone. But no one knows that. They just think Mr. Hart is just suddenly awesome. Mr. Hart escapes and is able to... Not explaining it, but he's able to undo the blackmail thing, so they can't blackmail him anymore. He goes to the office like, you guys are screwed. Like, then he goes in the office, doesn't even recognize him. Am I even on the right floor? And they explain the many changes they've made, and he's like, well, we're going to undo all this as soon as I get my shit together, blah, blah, blah. You guys are all going to jail, you fucking bitches, blah, blah, blah. Then, as it turns out at the end, the big boss comes down, like the big boss, who's this eccentric, crazy dude who looks kind of like Colonel Sanders to me. I don't know. And he's like, this is amazing. Like, you've just totally transformed this office, Mr. Hart. Like, just meeting him. Once again, it's movie serendipity where the big boss just happens to be coming down while this shit has reached its climax. And he wants Mr. Hart to explain how he's made this office so much better, at which point Mr. Hart's like, gloip, you know. Well, my Violet here's my kind of my right-hand man, woman, whatever. You know, she can tell you all about it. I'm happy to do it, sir, you know. So she goes around and explains how she's transformed everything, how some of the, like one lady in the office is an alcoholic, and thanks to Mr. Hart's, you know, quote unquote, Mr. Hart's new AA assistance program, you know, she's turned her life around and everything's right. Now there's daycare here and just everything's awesome. And just goes through the many changes, and like the big boss is sitting there, Mr. Hart's kind of like, oh yeah, this is totally my idea and shit. And the big boss, like, this is awesome stuff, man. You've done a fantastic job. Like, we had this back when I was in the war or whatever the fuck. And he's so impressed with Mr. Hart. You know, Mr. Hart, you can't work here anymore. You have to come work for my new facility in Brazil. And he's like, Brazil? And it's like, yeah, I need you. I need you here. You're not going to say no to me, are you? I'm the big man, blah, blah, blah. It's just a great little turnaround. It's a silly, you know, things are all fixed by coincidence. But still, I mean, I've seen worse endings than that, and it does play out. As old as this movie is, and as dated as the jokes should be, this actually is still hella entertaining and funny. I mean, some of the slapstick stuff, there's like a bit of trouble with the photocopier, for example, where it's like, well, the newfangled photocopier from 1980 is enormous and stuff flies out of it. It's not easy to operate. Haha, isn't that funny? Not really, but that's my point. Otherwise, this holds up as an amazing film. I originally wanted to do this because I was like, well, let's go through that. Let's go through that, then do follow-up. Fair enough? Going through this, the last part of this, the whole reason I did this was, I think I mentioned earlier, I had just watched a video critiquing, I think it was in the Washington Post, where it's like, oh, anyone who criticizes the Ghostbusters film just because you just can't handle a film with strong women characters as the protagonists. You misogynist, sexist son of a bitch. And I'd just seen a couple of videos where people just dismantled that argument very well, much better than I ever will. But at the same time, like I said, the examples they were using as movies weren't wrong, but not quite right. Because there are a ton of films. Recently, you had Lucy with, what's her face? I'm terrible with names. But you had Lucy, which was a great film. Doesn't get much more stronger female protagonist than someone who's omnipotent. Like I said, I think I mentioned Mary Poppins, Aeon Flux. They're just so many. But they weren't quite right because they didn't quite fit. A better example is Bridesmaids, which was also done by, Paul Feig, and had some of the same actresses. But it wasn't quite perfect. Because those two films, bearing in mind I haven't seen Bridesmaids, but from what I understand, and like I said, I'm not going to see Ghostbusters, but they aren't quite the same type of film. That's why I thought the 9 to 5 was genius, because on my part, because it's very similar in that respect. It's about three female protagonists who are strong people, strong women, strong people in their own right, who are struggling against their own personal issues at home in their lives, but also against their antagonist vis-a-vis Mr. Hart, and seeing them overcome and so on. And this is, make no mistake, this is a full-blown This movie is a comedy, much the same way Ghostbusters wants to be a comedy. It's a bunch of jokes and situational comedy. It is, once again, I haven't seen Ghostbusters, don't intend to, but from what I've seen from the trailers and people's description of it, a lot of situational comedy. There are jokes in 9 to 5, but it relies more on the setup, like the scene itself is the joke. And the situations are the funny part. And it's good. It's real good. The Ghostbusters film is lost money, and it's a flop. It is a flop, period. It's not making its money back. This movie did, in fact, let's go look at history. This movie, 1980, had a budget of $10 million, box office $103 million. 10 times a gimme. Oh, slightly more than that. Oh, 1980, that means with advertising, this movie, even with advertising and the fact that the film, that's the gross. The net is probably less than half of that. Still, that movie made a ton of money. And it won awards. And it deserved to. This was a very good film. My take on this is, if you want to debunk either argument, like I said, there's also the argument floating around that women can't be funny in movies. Like, I thought that was the most ridiculous argument, because I've seen tons of comedies with women as in them as part of the cast or as the principal character or something. It's like, that doesn't follow at all. But this film is just the perfect to just destroy it. And the fact that it's, at this point, 36 years old, it's been around for a while. So, not only can women be funny in comedies, but they were as far back as 1980. Probably further, but this is just using this example, which is an excellent one. And that's all I have to say about that. Let's do the okay, last bit, because this is already way too long for a review of a movie from 1980. What are the odds you'll see this and not like it? Low. I'd say best 1 in 6. Because it's pretty good. Not a comedy like this, an office comedy, isn't everyone's cup of tea, and it is from 1980. That said, it holds up really well. I think there's a good, 1 in 6, a 5 in 6 chance that you will like this, that this will speak to you, or at the very least you'll be entertained and amused. It's 110 minutes long. It is almost 2 hours, which, once again, from that era, 1980s, I'm accustomed to movies being closer to 90 minutes. Like, a lot of my favorite movies from when I was a kid were 83 minutes long, or at best 90-some. So this one has a fair running time. There's a long setup. The arc I describe, everyone gets into conflict with Mr. Hart and everything, that doesn't happen until 40 minutes into the film. The first half hour is just the setup. This is how awful Mr. Hart is. This is who each of the characters are. This is what their situation is. And the long setup works pretty good for this film. For something else, it might be come on, let's get this going. Works for this one. It's fine. Would I see it again? Not right away. I just saw it for the first time since I was a teenager. And that was on cable however long ago. And when I was 13, 14, 30 years ago. So, the last time I saw this was 30 years ago. Would I see it before I turned 73? Yes, it's good enough to watch again. If someone told me, they saw this video or heard that I did this video, it's I kind of want to see it. Do you want to see it with me? And I'd say yes. It's not... Some films, I think, are just so engaging and have so much interesting going on, either story ideally story and visually and so on, with enough complexity and Easter eggs and shit in the background that even if I've heard this already because I've seen it already, you can still watch it again because there's more to see, there's more to pay attention to, and it's still engaging and funny or whatever. This film, not as much. It's just an office comedy. There's no spectacular special effects. The Dolly Parton song is really good, but the rest of it isn't as good. Like the rest of the soundtrack's very forgettable. I couldn't tell you anything else that's in it. But would I see it again? Yeah, but not right away. Like I'd prefer to wait a little bit before I saw this movie again, at least a week or so. But I'd watch it again. It's good. Like and subscribe. That's all. I'm out.